Thank you to everyone for coming out. It is a rare pleasure for Aliki and I to be able to present together because throughout the course of our work, we have been trying to cover from Key West to Pensacola and every point in between. So this may be, if it's not the first time we presented together, it's one of the first times we presented together. And I always say, if there was one thing that we did right in the Water and Land Legacy campaign, it was hiring Aliki Moncrief. Those of you who worked with her know that about her, so it's really exciting to be here. It's also exciting to see so many folks who I know worked really hard on this campaign. I see Bill Richards with Paddle Florida. I saw John Jopling with Ishnatechny, obviously Marilee and Lou. So I want to thank all of you. I just want to see a show of hands. How many folks here actually collected petitions for Florida's Water and Land Legacy? Yay, look at that. Oh, Paul Still, look at you. I haven't seen you in ages. I also want to recognize Dr. Lee Nyblock, who's in the audience. He is our new Alachua County manager. He's probably trying to stay under the radar over there, but I'm not going to allow him to. He comes from a great history in parks and the Florida park system, and Marion County, which I will tell you, actually beat Alachua County in their percentage vote. So go Marion County. Thank you. Do we have anyone else here who's from Marion?
I was there when they voted for it.
Yes, Lee made sure, and he's going to bring those few extra percentage points up here to Alachua County, where we're always proud. We have a loud and proud history of being great on these issues here in Alachua County. So the thing that we wanted to really start with, and I'm sorry this is a little bit small, but hopefully if you can't see, the projection will be interesting enough in terms of what we say. One of the main things that people ask us is, well, why did you do a constitutional amendment? And I will tell you, it was no easy decision to come to that. A constitutional amendment, as you're going to hear, is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And it was certainly not the first thing that the coalition of groups and individuals who came together to pass Amendment 1 thought of. In fact, most of the largest and sort of most engaged organizations do employ lobbyists in Tallahassee. Some have contract lobbyists, and some have lobbyists on the staff, and some actually didn't have contract lobbyists, but actually realized that we were having such a hard time making any headway with the legislature that we had to go out and hire folks who were, former speakers of the House and things along those lines. And so many of these organizations do have very well-connected Tallahassee lobbyists, but starting in 2009, which of course coincided with the terrible recession that we faced here and elsewhere in our nation, the funding for these programs basically flatlined to zero. And this was after a really proud history going back to the Bob Martinez administration, that for 19 years, in good times and in bad, in Republican administrations and in Democratic, there had been consistently $300 million a year allocated to Florida Forever and the programs that are designated under Florida Forever, including protection through our 5 water management districts, through the Florida Communities Trust, which I know certainly cities throughout this area have taken advantage of to protect our wonderful resources here. And you can see in this chart, it was sort of going right along at $300 million a year. That one year that jumps out was actually during Jeb Bush's administration, where there was an individual, very large acquisition down in Southwest Florida. But then you can see that after 2009, the funding was reduced by an average, there were a few years that there were tiny designations of funding, but by an average of about 96% cut. Oh, that worked. Okay, try that again. Sorry about that. So the source of the funding for these programs has historically been the documentary stamp tax on real estate transactions, and that's 70 cents per $1,000 of real estate that's paid into this fund and has been paid into this fund going back for literally decades. And starting in about the 60s, there was a recognition that when the real estate market is really healthy and thriving in Florida, that's when resources are most at risk, right? And so it sort of made sense to connect the real estate transfer tax to land acquisition. And in fact, in the history of the real estate transfer tax, 25 of that 70 cents was levied by the legislature specifically for land acquisition. And so we came up using that as a guide and also looking at what are the needs in this state. What lands are on the Florida Forever list? What do we know about the existing lands that need improvement? What do we know about the endangered resources in the Everglades and the Indian River Lagoon and here in North Florida in our springs and rivers? And we came up with the notion of designating 1/3 of the documentary stamp tax toward these programs. Now, obviously, again, in good years, that would be a larger number, and when the real estate market is suffering, it would be a lower number. And so this actually indicates the doc stamp revenue. The most recent revenue estimates that come from the revenue estimating folks in Tallahassee is about $757 million a year. Now, Aliki's going to talk a little bit more about the process, but we really started, again, right here in Alachua County in December of 2011. Representatives of many of the state's leading conservation organizations came together at Alachua Conservation Trust's Prairie Creek Preserve out between Gainesville and Hawthorne. And the Trust for Public Land and Audubon and Nature Conservancy and the Wildlife Federation. Aliki was there for Environment Florida and some local land trusts. Obviously, Alachua Conservation Trust was represented. But we all came together and said, we can't continue on with the kind of lack of funding for protection of these resources and restoration of these resources as we have been for the last 4 or 5 years. So what can we do? And ultimately we came to the conclusion that this was, given the lack of success that we had encountered in Tallahassee, this was the only option, was to actually take it to citizens and allow citizens to have a voice. So that really kicked off a phase of deep research. It had already been underway. In fact, we had given some thought to doing this on the 2012 ballot and ultimately pulled back on that. So there had been research ongoing back as far as January of 2011. We sort of pulled the trigger, so to speak, to seek to move forward with a constitutional amendment in December of 2011. I think, I'm thinking out loud, Aliki, I don't think any of us had ever actually worked on a petition campaign. Will Abinger, who was really the campaign manager and initially the campaign chair and then the campaign manager, he's worked across the country on these, but historically mostly on ones that are referred to the ballot by elected bodies, whether it be legislature or a city or county commission. And so that was, for all of us, a little bit of a new thing. And then we went through a very extensive process, which Aliki was really key in, of leading a citizen petition drive. There was also, as you may know, a component of it that was paid, and that was actually driven by the fact that the legislature has actually made it extraordinarily difficult to get these measures on the ballot. There was a time when you could collect petitions for literally years on end, and some of the other campaigns that we're familiar with actually collected petitions, little at a time over the course of 3 and 4 and 5 years. That was actually substantially cut back, I think, in the 2011 session, right in that time frame. And so there's really a race to get on the ballot. And then we, of course, after we got on the ballot, which Aliki's going to talk about, we kicked into a campaign phase. As the collection is going, I want to pause and just talk to you about, well, what did people actually sign on the petition, and what do we now have in the Florida Constitution? And I'm just going to read it. And the reason I'm going to read it, I know it's a little tedious, and nobody likes anyone reading slides, but right now in Tallahassee, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, there is a robust discussion about what is and isn't fundable through Amendment 1. I'm sure you all have seen the media about that, and it's an ongoing robust debate is the term I'm going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and read the language just so that you can hear exactly what 75% of Florida voters, again, in a gubernatorial year, which is not the big presidential, but the more conservative electorate, voted on. Constitutional Amendment 1, Article 10, Section 28, Water and Land Conservation dedicates funds to acquire and restore Florida conservation and recreation lands. funds the Land Acquisition Trust Fund to acquire, restore, improve, and manage conservation lands, including wetlands and forests, fish and wildlife habitat, lands protecting water resources and drinking water sources, including the Everglades, and the water quality of rivers, lakes, and streams, beaches and shores, outdoor recreation lands, working farms and ranches, and historic or geologic sites by dedicating 33% of net revenues from the existing excise tax on documents for 20 years. So that was what appeared on the ballot. There's actually a longer section of law. It's funny that, Aliki went to Harvard Law School, but I like to talk about the law because, I'm just like that. But the actual language in the Constitution uses the word land 18 times. 18 times it says land. Now you hear some folks in Tallahassee say, well, this isn't really about acquiring land. So we'll see. The process itself, as we said earlier, there were nearly 1 million signatures collected. That was in order to assure that we got 683,149 valid signatures, because as you know, there are many reasons that petitions are not accepted as valid. The one we actually saw, there was a relatively deep analysis done right here in Alachua County because Doug Hornbeck likes to do stuff like that, if any of you know Doug. But the most common reasons that petitions were thrown out was people signing twice, signatures not matching, people using a local address here, for example, in Alachua County or Leon County saw a lot of this as well, that were college students but were registered to vote back home, so they didn't have a valid registration, so on. But we ended up with over 709,000 valid petitions, so we did overshoot our goal by quite a bit. And actually, each one of the supervisors of elections, and we didn't have petitions in all 67 counties, but we had petitions in... Did we have all 67? Okay. There were a few that were a little sketchy, but in general, it was the larger urban counties where we had the largest number of petitions, and each supervisor of elections is required by law to charge us 10 cents per petition to double check that it's a valid signature, that it's a valid address, that it isn't the second of the same one, and so on. And then we had to go through two technical processes. One was a review by the Supreme Court, which was a unanimous decision, and they didn't even hear oral arguments on it, which we were, actually, we were a little disappointed because we wanted to see, the Supreme Court in action. But it was such a strong determination that this was clearly constitutional. And then the second was actually a very fascinating process. I mean, if you want to feel good about our state government, I recommend at some point you go sit through the the Fiscal Impact Estimating Conference, the Financial Impact Estimating Conference. Financial Impact Estimating Conference. Anyway, it starts with an F. But it's representatives of all different aspects of the state government, including the governor's office, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the real sort of accountants and folks who really understand Florida's budget. And they got down and did like an 18 or 20-page report of exactly what things in Florida's budget should be considered eligible for this and what shouldn't, and how much debt service still exists going back to Florida forever, and all these kinds of things. And it went on for 3 days.
Well, yeah, the actual testimony was a few days, but it was a several-week-long process.
Yeah, it was a several-week-long process, and it was actually, we had to have a representative in the process, and all of those other folks had representatives in the process, and it was actually a really thorough and robust debate, and I only wish that more of our elected leaders paid attention to what actually came out of that debate. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Aliki, and she will finish out the presentation, and then we will take questions.
Well, Pegeen gave me the super fun slide to talk about, and that is when we qualified for the ballot. As she mentioned, there was both a signature, the total number of signature requirements. There was also a geographic distribution requirement. So we couldn't just get all of our signatures in the 3 largest counties in the state. We actually had to get at least half of Florida's 27 congressional districts. And so that's what this slide shows you. The counties, or the congressional districts in blue are the parts of the state that where we first crossed that threshold of meeting the number of signatures that we needed. So we were super elated to find that we were Amendment 1 because being the first issue on the ballot, it's always a good thing. You don't have to worry about people dropping off, losing interest in these items on the ballot. So we thought that was incredibly helpful. The other thing that was really helpful once we were on the ballot was that all throughout the campaign, going back to when we were actually still collecting signatures, we had incredibly widespread media support. We even had some editorial support that was unsolicited. You know, I think it was August 7th of 2012, I will never forget that date. The Miami Herald was the first newspaper to editorialize in favor of the amendment, and that's what, we hadn't even reached out to them. So throughout the course of the campaign, both when we were signature gathering and then also once we were on the ballot, we had an incredible outpouring of support pretty much throughout the state. One of my favorites was actually the Pensacola News Journal. It was a fire and brimstone, you should pass Amendment 1 for God's creation. It was, I mean, really fantastic editorial support for Amendment 1. So we really ran the gamut, which also kind of goes to show you, and you may have already mentioned this, but one of the things that I think appealed to both people signing the petition, but then also people voting for it, was that it really doesn't matter what political party you belong to, it doesn't matter what your race is, what your gender, what your age is. Protecting water and land in Florida, it's pretty much a no-brainer. It crosses all kinds of divides that otherwise put us, sometimes pit people against each other in our state. And so the amazing media support that we saw, I think, reflected that. So when we got started, as Pegeen already mentioned, you know, we were sort of 13 core conservation organizations that put up the funding to make sure that we were doing polling, that we were researching what are the legal requirements, what are the political committee filing requirements, how do we get this ball going? And so these groups up here, and Pegeen's already mentioned several of them, were sort of the initial brain trust that went and reached out to the broader conservation community to get support and to get us rolling. During the petition gathering phase and then through the election, we broadened to get support from more than 400 organizations across the state, many of which are not what you would think of as your typical or traditional environmental groups. We had the League of Women Voters come on board. We had groups like the NAACP, the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association, which, you know, that's a huge testament to how important our natural resources are to our, I think it's our #1 industry, tourism. We also had other groups like labor organizations come up in support of the amendment. And so we started as a conservation movement, but by the time we were on the ballot and by the time we actually were communicating with voters, Amendment 1 was much more than that. So really, the support for Amendment 1, and on our website, if you all want to dig into the numbers and look at it by county and look at it by Senate district and House district, we have all the data on our website. You can kind of plug around and see particular details for different areas. But what this shows you is Senate districts. And so you can see the darkest green areas are the areas of the highest support. There's only one Senate district that didn't quite pass the 60% threshold. It was 57.1%. So still a pretty strong majority. So we painted the state green with Amendment 1, and when you look at the House districts, you can see very similarly that the support was really overwhelming. I think Pegeen mentioned that this wasn't a particularly huge turnout election. It was an off-year election, unlike presidential elections. And so to get that kind of support throughout the state is pretty phenomenal. What it ended up being is 4.2 million people signed on in support of Amendment 1. So before we go on into talking a little bit about our sponsor, as a sponsor committee, Florida's Water and Land Legacy, and our coalition's position on things, I thought we could take just a few minutes, if it's okay, to break up if we want to talk about kind of, okay, the process or how we got off the ballot before we have discussions further about the sort of what we're doing in the legislature now to try to implement. Does that sound okay? That's fine. And she's looking at me. Yeah, sorry. Let me explain why I'm a little both on Kathy Street with the Intertech We Alliance, but I've been asked to facilitate question and answer periods here. So she just broke with protocol, and it's okay because I like it. And so, based on what Pegeen and Aliki have already informed us about, educated us about, questions from the audience, and I'm going to do my best to see all hands. I don't know everybody here, but get everybody's questions answered so they don't have to worry about hands and they can concentrate on answering questions. So, show of hands and I'll start. Yes, Bob, saw you first.
I just saw, I guess, a news blip from H2O Coalition, which sounds like a really great group, saying that there's too much land in public ownership in Florida, and this is a really bad thing. And so I was wondering how you combat that, or how you argue against that decision of theirs.
Sure.
So first off, the Florida H2O Coalition, that does really sound like a great coalition. It is a project of Associated Industries in Florida. And so I'll just leave that at that. As far as the argument that they're making with respect to Florida owning too much land, they're looking at the total amount of land that's in conservation, both managed and owned by the federal government and also by state and local governments. So when you look at that entire picture, you're talking about huge swaths of areas like the Everglades, Big Cypress National Park. You're talking about areas that could not be developed, that are essentially untouchable for conservation purposes and have been for a long time and pretty unanimously are supported as such. So that is the 27% figure, the 1/3 that they are often talking around. When you look at the state conservation lands, it's about 14%. And as Pegeen mentioned with the Florida Forever list, the remaining lands that have been identified as being critical for protecting our water recharge areas, for protecting endangered species, for serving as buffers to climate change impacts and sea level rise and that sort of thing, those lands, it's about 1.8 to 2 million acres of land remaining on the Florida Forever list. And even if we were to acquire all of those, I think it adds no more than 5% to what comes under state ownership. So that's kind of just the numbers.
Yeah,
you asked about what our response.
Yeah, how do you counter that? Because H2O Coalition, I mean, that sounds wonderful.
Well, maybe part of the way I've heard the arguments, part of the way I've heard their, and it's not necessarily just them, but that general argument described is, well, we don't want to buy land for land's sake. Well, the reason you buy land is not just for the land's sake, it's to protect the spring sheds. So for example, since I know pretty much everyone in this room probably cares about springs, I'll use that as an example. Jim Stevenson, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, who we'll call the Springs Alliance now, but he was a long-time chief biologist with the Florida State Park System. I'm going to steal something that he said to me, which I think is a compelling argument against the too much land argument. And that is that if you just own the spring, all you own is a hole in the ground. You have to own enough of the spring shed. You have to keep enough of the spring shed in a natural state in order for that spring to be more than a hole in the ground. So those are the types of arguments that we make back, and that is you have to protect the water at the source. You know, there are lots of different strategies that we can employ to protect our water resources, and certainly there are some more engineered solutions that can be appropriate in different areas. But the reality is that one of the key tools is protecting the land around our waters. And it just so happens that Amendment 1 was very focused on that particular tool. So by supporting Amendment 1 and by making sure that funding is going to land acquisition, for example, to protect water at the source, we're not saying that other tools aren't also important. It's that this particular tool had gone unfunded for too long and we needed to refund it. So it's a little bit of a long-winded apologize, but it's a great question because you know what? We're all getting those questions. We're all hearing that as we're out and about. Let me take a question from over here. I know I saw a hand up. Maybe I didn't. I hate it when that happens. I'm coming back over here. Yes, sir.
You alluded to the difficulty of getting this amendment on the ballot, and I was wondering what were some of the obstacles that you had to overcome to get this amendment on the ballot?
I'll go ahead and take that. You know, one of the main ones is something that we've already sort of talked about, which is that there are many people who kind of, when we were out gathering petitions, would say, you know, I really agree with the goal that you're talking about, but I don't believe in constitutional amendments. And we actually ran up against that with some of our strongest allies. In fact, the League of Women Voters, which turned out to be an extraordinarily powerful ally, they had just come out, when we went to them in the spring of 2013 to ask for their support, they were pretty down on constitutional amendments because in the 2012 session, the legislature had referred something like a dozen measures to the ballot. Now, I think all but one of them failed, but the League of Women Voters had gotten very sort of skeptical about that as a methodology for, implementing policy. And the only response that I think we all agree, you don't just go willy-nilly amending the Constitution, but the problem was that we had run up against this extraordinarily difficult political landscape, and it was but we knew that Floridians cared, so it was the only methodology that we felt like we had open to us. And as much as we wanted to preserve the sanctity of the Constitution, we thought it was also critically important to preserve the sanctity of our water resources, our natural lands, and the parts of Florida that we hold most dear. So that was sort of one of the first ones. The second one is that, especially in the early going, there was a lot of skepticism, even among our friends, as to whether or not we would make the ballot. And so we had a really hard time raising funds, which unfortunately are necessary to do, anything that requires communication, outreach, and so on and so forth. By the time, the books were closed on the whole thing, I think we raised from all vehicles on the order of $8 million. And it was, in many cases, by hook or by crook. I mean, there were times that all of us, Will Abinger, I, Manley Fuller, others, wrote personal checks to make sure that we, paid what we had to pay. All of the major conservation organizations made donations, and in some cases loans that didn't get paid back. At some point we made an agreement. We're like, "Are you guys okay that we're not going to pay this back?" It was easier after we got that 75%. But a lot of things that happen in politics in the United States of America are driven by some kind of big industrial interest. In this particular case, most, not all, but many of the big industrial interests in Florida were not on board with what we were doing. So
Let's take one more, Mr. Joplin, and then we'll let them finish with their presentation, then we'll make sure we get everybody's questions answered, okay?
Everybody that's followed politics, probably Florida or anywhere else, understands and you create a new pot of money, $750 million, is going to be lots of birds of prey or circling to try to get their talons on it. And we've seen projects get diverted to purpose for a lot of money for education on the line. Can you tell us briefly what are the biggest threats to the intended use of Amendment 1 funds that we're facing now? And by that I mean both in terms of identifying the opposition that's trying to do that and the other purposes that they would put this on.
It's very early in the session, John. I will say, and we had a discussion about this this morning, the clearest picture we have right now is the budget that's been proposed by Governor Scott. And there are some very good aspects of Governor Scott's budget. In fact, I think here we would be happy in this neck of the woods that there's a substantial allocation of $50 million, I think, for Springs. There's $150 million for Florida Forever. There's $150 million for Everglades. It does cover the existing debt service, which we felt from the beginning was an appropriate use. That going back to, again, as I said, the Martinez administration and throughout every administration since then, there's been a lot of issuance of bonds to purchase lands, and so we agreed with that. It is not. There are some aspects of the governor's budget that some amongst us we have robust debates about, but I think in general it's relatively true to the intent of Amendment 1, and to the credit of Governor Scott's staff, they have been actively working to communicate with the Amendment 1 coalition and work in concert. The House and the Senate are actually, I just today got from Representative Clovis Watson's office the implementing bill in the House. It's 191 pages long, and I got it about 4 o'clock, so I haven't read it yet. But we will be, working to try to build that. But, as we're discussing, there are many, many well-represented interests in Tallahassee. As you said, there's, when somebody sees dollar signs, they try to figure out how to get a piece of them. But, we do feel, and we are, working hard, that because it was such a broad mandate, really a mandate, many of these folks are coming from districts. I mean, I was joking about Alachua and Marion, but the difference was like between 71 and 72, right? It wasn't like it was between 49 and 51. So, and any of the South Florida counties where we have very high population, I mean, Palm Beach County was 85, almost 85%. 85%. So, we do think at the end of the day, we should be able to prevail in that way. But it's a challenge. We need you all to call and write to your legislators, particularly if you're connected and Republican.
Well, that sort of segues into where we can get into, obviously that's where a lot of the interest lies. So what happens now that we won, now that we are part of the Constitution? And so these are just kind of a couple of bullet points that are what we are presenting whenever we have meetings. And by we, I mean our coalition partners, I mean volunteers who are talking with their legislators. These are the things that we're trying to emphasize and really drive home for legislators. One is that Amendment 1 is for conservation. And that I'm going to jump to the second to last, actually, because alternative funding sources for wastewater and water supply, that is one of the big topics that has come up as potential drain on Amendment 1 funding. Some of the problems that we see across the state relating to wastewater and water supply are multi-billion dollar, multi-year problems. And so Amendment 1 by itself is never going to be able to solve those problems, and really wasn't intended to. So that's one of the things that we're always trying to remind our legislators of, is that, one, that's a really big problem. Amendment 1 is not exactly the right tool to fix that problem, and there are alternative sources of funding that we try to point them to. So, for example, there's a federal fund, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, where communities can get matching dollars from the federal government to help with various wastewater infrastructure type of issues. And so we're constantly pointing to that as, we need to bolster that program up. We need to make sure that the state is getting our share of those funds. So those are the kinds of messages that we're trying to emphasize and underline for legislators. As we've already talked about a lot, we're constantly talking about the tremendous popular support, because what we've seen is that legislators are paying attention. I have not been in any single, I have not been in a single committee meeting that's about the environment. It's not even about Amendment 1, where the will of the voters has been, they paid some homage to, where legislators have referenced that. They understand, I think, that Amendment 1 really was a broad mandate. And so whenever we're meeting with them, we're constantly pointing out, well, there were 43,106 votes in your district. And they do the math. They realize, wait a second, that's more people than voted for me. So they do, those sort of messages do resonate. They are paying attention, and that's why we're constantly focusing on them. The other thing that and we did it today, we emphasize that the language really is not as vague as some might say. It's very clear, it's very direct. It starts very simply that this is to finance and refinance to acquire, restore, improve, and manage conservation lands, and then it lists all of these different purposes. But that core concept is at the very beginning of the amendment. amendment. So we try to drive home the idea that it's really quite clear. In fact, we probably should be adding, so clear that the Supreme Court does not even need to take oral argument on it. Protecting water at the source, I already talked about that a little bit. It is the Water and Land Conservation Amendment, so it isn't just about land, it's also not just about water. And so we do have to constantly marry those two things when we're speaking. And the other thing is that there's no impact on other important services. The big one that's always a question in folks' mind is affordable housing, because affordable housing and transportation, because they come from the same, they also tap into documentary stamp tax in order to achieve funding. And so the way that Amendment 1 is written, the way that it is implemented, there is no reason why it has to take away from these other services. We're in a budget surplus year, for starters, so there's plenty of money for both fully funding Amendment 1 and housing and transportation out of outstanding revenues. Whether or not the legislature changes things around so as to change that is another matter. But Amendment 1 by itself doesn't impact these other services. So to give you a sense of some of the things that amendment dollars will be spent on, we've already talked about some of these. Springs protection, in the recommendation that our coalition put forward, and as it so happens in Governor Scott's proposal, we're putting forward that at least $60 million has to go to springs protection. And some of that, when you have an approved plan on how to protect the spring that includes maybe some land acquisition components, but also some engineered components, that in those circumstances, Amendment 1 dollars might be appropriate. Debt service, Pegeen already mentioned. Everglades, estuaries, northern Everglades. The Everglades is actually written into the amendment. It appeared in front of voters, and it's in the Constitution. Florida Forever, which we've talked about already. Land management, we haven't really talked about it a lot tonight, but the amendment was specifically written to make sure that funding could be made available to manage the lands that we already have, to make sure that we're restoring existing public lands, to make sure that we're taking care of them. That wasn't the case necessarily so much, and Pegeen can speak in more detail about this, but that wasn't the case with Florida Forever and P2000. Those were programs that were very much more land acquisition focused. And so Amendment 1 was written with the deliberate intent of making sure that there was more room for land management funding. Rural and family lands, this is a program where it's a conservation easement heavy programs to help keep working farms and ranches, keep them as working farms and ranches and not strip malls, because when they're a working farm or ranch, they provide a lot more environmental service in terms of wildlife corridor and aquifer recharge and what have you. And then finally, beach and shore management, which is something that is currently funded and was funded prior to Amendment 1 passing. I'm not even going to rely on this slide because from your perspective, I'm sure the font is very small. But really, it's just intended to illustrate that, and Pegeen already made this point, that when it comes to matching up what the coalition has put forward as sort of the baseline first year of the 20-year amendment cycle proposition on how to allocate funding, the governor's budget is very close in a lot of key respects when it comes to land acquisition for forever, when it comes to Everglades, and when it comes to springs. Those are the three places where there's a great alignment between our proposal and the governor's. So now we can really get into questions. I apologize for going rogue earlier. But now we can really open up the floor to other questions. And doesn't it make sense that these two women that spearheaded this Tasmanian devil thing that turned into Amendment 1 would be rebels? So it makes sense, right? Yes.
My question, I live in Hot Springs here. My question actually is a practical now question. This city, back in, I think in 2006, the fellow who's building Bailey Estates back here owns 15.2 acres of forest that fronts the High Springs. So not only is it about land, it's also about water. And the pumping station where they used to service trains here the remains of the pumping station that they used to pump water to the steam locomotives. So it's an historical question as well. And unfortunately, what happened was they offered to buy the land from this developer for, I believe, $300,000, and they were carrying on state funds to purchase the land, and the man then raised the price of the land, and the funding fell through. But in that interim between then and now, they got him to rezone the land as a conservationist land, and he wants it returned to the residential land. And there's a legality in there that they can't fight. So when I attended just one of the recent public hearings, many public hearings right now, they are on the verge of rezoning this land again, and I suggested to them that if and when Amendment 1 comes through, I understand it's still in legislation, of course, they're still working out the details, that they might combine the original, I think it was Alachua County Forever was going to help fund it, with some of the Amendment 1 funds. So my question to you folks is this. Even if they rezone it, you know, if there's still the hope that they could then reoffer it to a reoffer, and I believe that the price is now up to $700,000. And is there anything, any way that, you know, we could discuss how we can get the city commission in on this possibility?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a couple of things embedded in your question which are good opportunities to talk about both the historical programs and what we imagine will likely be the framework going forward. The first one is that this is a willing seller only program, meaning that if a seller chooses not to offer their land for sale or isn't happy with whatever price they're offered, the government cannot compel them to sell their land as they can, for example, with road projects or jails or other things that sometimes eminent domain has been used. Now, I will say governments have gotten much more squeamish about eminent domain in the last decade or two than they used to be back in the good old day when they would drive through with the interstate highway. There's gotten to be much more orientation toward respect of private property rights in general. But land acquisition programs in the state of Florida have never relied on compelling people to sell their land. And so in this particular case, or any case, you would want to rely on the good graces of the individual to want to sell it. The second piece is price. These programs are always done using appraisal processes, and normally, the larger the price of the land, the more likely it is you have to get more than one appraisal. If there's a difference between the two appraisals, sometimes you actually even have to go to a third appraisal. Now, one of the aspects of Governor Scott's administration in particular, and it's interesting because he and Secretary Putnam, I'm sorry, I want to get the titles right. Adam Putnam actually was arguing in the cabinet recently that sometimes you have to pay a little more than appraised value in order to close the deal, which, certainly has been my experience working on various land acquisition and other projects. Sometimes, the difference between $700,000 and $725,000 is the difference between getting the land and not getting the land. But Governor Scott is I think we all understand, a very fiscally conservative leader, and his goal is to get everything in at 90% of appraised value. So those things that come before the governor and cabinet, and there have been still projects coming before the governor and cabinet. Now, the program that is actually my personal favorite among all of the many Florida Forever programs, because as you heard in the intro, I'm a local government person, is the Florida Communities Trust. And the Florida Communities Trust was a program that for many, many years, and many of the cities in Alachua County, I'm guessing it may have been the one that High Springs was pursuing, as well as the county itself, have taken advantage of the Florida Communities Trust program. It's a very apolitical program. If your project meets the criteria, it should be acquired. And it's actually very driven by either local governments or even nonprofits. In fact, when I was an employee of Alachua Conservation Trust more than a decade ago, we did a number of FCT projects in which we acquired them completely in the nonprofit sector with now the county had to say, Lee, just so you know, the county had to say, if this organization ever goes belly up, the county will take this land, but that was the only real involvement of county government. So I don't know, I'm not familiar with the details of this specific project. It's actually, I was sitting here thinking, it's sort of a shame that the High Spring Herald went to wherever, the great beyond of newspaper journalists, because it was a great source of information, and we don't, even as close by as Gainesville, we don't hear all the time what's happening in the beautiful jewels of communities that we have across our county. But, willing seller, if the local government's on board, all to the better. The county, I think that they are winding down the Alachua County Forever program, but, that doesn't mean that there may not be some opportunities in the future. I think certainly you can approach the county for assistance, and actually the smaller the local government, the less of a match you have to necessarily provide. They're actually, if you're, I think, city less than 10,000, which High Springs is, I think you aren't required even to put in a match, and so it might be more, again, a management partnership or something along those lines.
They're in the process right now, in this last committee meeting, where they realized, this deal was done when the land was sky high in value, and so they really need to reappraise it, and they can probably get it for much less than $700,000. But also,
Thank you. You know what? No, I appreciate your question, and I know these women do too, and I do want you to know that they're going to stick around a little bit afterwards as well. But I want to give some time to some other folks too, and I hope you understand that. Great.
And I'll just to close out, local projects, come talk to me. I'm more than happy to hear what the deal is and see if I can help.
Great. Back there.
Wastewater is gray water, and I would also contend that wastewater is a great issue. As the city of Gainesville has shown, wastewater can actually be used for aquifer recharge. And the key to doing that, to purify that wastewater for recharge, is the acquisition of land. For example, the Florida Springs Institute has a project in for Amendment 1 funds that would help provide land for purifying Jacksonville wastewater, which never gets back into the aquifer, and putting it back into the aquifer. Would you advise against this sort of a wastewater project?
So you stuck right at my vulnerable underbelly, which is anything having to do with the city of Gainesville was, of course, in the great era. But I want to touch on. There are two projects in the city of Gainesville that actually did come out of the tenure that I served that I think they're wastewater, stormwater projects, but they actually both have origins in these land conservation programs. One is the great and wonderful Depot Park in downtown Gainesville. That was acquired by the city of Gainesville through the Florida Communities Trust. And the stormwater goes in just south of the depot there. It goes in and it's treated and then it flows out, but it eventually goes into Sweetwater Branch and into Paynes Prairie. But that project, first of all, it's a public park. It's open to the public. Second of all, it's got wildlife benefits. Birds come, turtles swim, so on and so forth. Thirdly, it's got recreational aspects. There are trails all around. Same thing for the Paynes Prairie Sheep Flow Project, which is on the verge of opening to the public, and you will just be astounded. In fact, Alachua Audubon, which was one of our great signature gathering organizations, came to the city of Gainesville recently and said, please open this. We want it open on a regular basis because the bird watching is unbelievable. That too, and it was a partnership between the city of Gainesville, Alachua County, the state of Florida, because it was, again, it was on the northern end of Paynes Prairie. So to me, and I'm speaking for myself, but I think that we've talked about this because there certainly is a recognition that there are these needs with regard to stormwater, wastewater, and so on. And there may be some narrow definition where Amendment 1 dollars, because it is also providing public access, recreation, wildlife habitat in addition to groundwater recharge, as you mentioned, that it hits on so many cylinders, and what we're really driving toward is, I think, the kind of work that you all are doing. The Springs Institute is demonstrate that this has these values, and don't just, do some earmark based on nothing more than I'm pulling something out of the air. And is there an adopted, based on management plan that this implements, or is there a regulatory approval from the water management district or something? I mean, is there something that really demonstrates that this project isn't just, helping some developer out, opening new lands for development, one of the things that I do think is a strong principle around these issues, and it was interesting because I read it in reference to the Medicaid funding today, because that's one of the other huge issues that the legislature is having to deal with right now. But one of their goals in that is to inject personal responsibility into the Medicaid process, and I would say we should inject personal responsibility into managing our wastewater as well. We want to see communities and utilities and individuals pay some substantial portion of that, and then government can come in, state government can come in and help. But again, we want to see these projects clearly be protecting the resource, because not every wastewater project, as you guys know, because you deal with this, is really protecting the resource.
Great. Yes, please.
You mentioned that you made the point that Amendment 1 includes Everglades restoration as a justifiable use of those funds. And right now there's this sense of urgency about U.S. sugar lands, I think on the order of 30,000 acres in Hendry County, and the state has an option to purchase which will expire at some point later this year. I'm curious if the coalition has a position on that particular Everglades restoration component, and I'm also curious about that sense of urgency. Does it really have any merit? I mean, those lands aren't magically just going to disappear and not be there next year. And apparently a lot of those tens of thousands of acres aren't actually needed, so the state could be on the hook owning a bunch of sugar land that it doesn't need for Everglades restoration.
Great. Well, to answer your first question as to whether or not we have a position on that particular buy, certainly Everglades and spending on the Everglades, including land buying in the Everglades or restoration projects, are eligible for Amendment $1. Our coalition is not taking a position on whether or not that particular land buy is the best solution, is a good solution. It's really something that our coalition partners are all very much more knowledgeable about and have been involved with over the years. So groups like Audubon Florida and Sierra Club and the Everglades Foundation. So we really don't have we're not chiming in on, well, is it a good idea or a bad idea to buy that land? It would be eligible under the language of Amendment 1. To your second question, the urgency is coming from the option to buy in the contract between the state of Florida and U.S. Sugar. That expires. And so if the state and U.S. Sugar don't negotiate a deal to purchase that land, I believe by May 1st of this year, the option to buy or purchase that land disappears. So that's where the urgency is coming from.
Yeah, and going back to the discussion we had about willing sellers, when that deal was negotiated during the Christ administration, U.S. Sugar was a willing seller. Today, they actually are walking back on that deal. They're not comfortable with consummating that deal, but they have to because they entered into a contract if the state pursues it. But those are sort of, if I understand it correctly, some of the political dynamics behind it, that if the state really felt like they wanted and needed that land, they can go acquire that land because U.S. Sugar entered into a contract back during the Christ administration. But their model has sort of changed since then. I mean, I will tell you that, and this is just me speaking again, But our partners that are most knowledgeable about the Everglades Foundation, Audubon Florida, Florida Wildlife Federation, they are supportive of doing that deal. Now, I will also tell you that the projected amount of money needed would be very, very difficult to take all out of Amendment 1 in a single year. And historically, the approach would have been, well, we'll bond it. As I mentioned earlier, Governor Scott is very fiscally cautious, and he is not one to want to bond money. So this is a very interesting, but I think a lot of the water quality issues that we see associated with Lake Okeechobee, the perception is that you cannot solve those without some substantial additional land acquisition. Whether that's the right amount, the right location, the right deal, I'm not knowledgeable of that, but I will tell you that many of our coalition partners believe it should be pursued.
You have a question?
Yeah, I want to bring it back to Alachua County for a second. And just looking at this article, it was in the Gainesville Sun. The largest funding request in Alachua County is the Bivens Arm Lake Dredging Project, $12 million. So I'd like to know, first of all, do you think this is eligible under Amendment 1? And second of all, do you support it? And if not, what do you think we should do about it?
No.
It's like the other.
No.
Okay then.
Okay, I'll elaborate. I've known Representative Perry for many years, and I think I have some respect and affection for him. This legislative session, he is trying my affection, at least. I still have respect. I will say, and I want to go back to sort of the. I told Aliki I was going to behave tonight. I'm challenged with this. Okay, I'm going to start with Bivens Arm. Really does need attention. There is no doubt that Bivens Arm, as a very stressed urban water body, needs attention, and that I think we would. Any objective person would agree to that. The challenge associated with that specific request is that there has been no science, no engineering, no analysis of alternatives that these projects would normally be subjected to in a very rigorous way. And so, should Bivens Arm be cleaned up? Should it be given love and affection? Yes, of course it should. Is this the right time? Is that the right option? Is that the right amount? I don't think we have any information that would indicate that it is.
So then, is the legislature going to deny this funding request?
So that request went in. It was submitted by Representative Perry himself without any. Most of the requests were approved with support of the local government of jurisdiction. That one was not. It went directly from Representative Perry. The committee that asked for those to be submitted got $1.2 billion worth of requests. Again, even if they decided we're going to put all of the Amendment 1 money into addressing water needs and water projects in accordance with this particular committee's requests, it would at most be less than a third, just because again, after you take off debt service and some of the other things that we think are relatively non-controversial, you get down to a couple, $300,000-$400,000 worth of brand new funding. And so, let's be generous and say all of the funding. Let's look at the extreme and say all of the funding is going to water projects. Well, that would really only be a third of the request at $1.2 billion, and the request showing up with no backup and no local government sponsor, I think is not probably going to rise right to the top. That was hard. Because I do. As I say, I think he's I think he's a big man. I think he's well-intentioned. I think the lake needs attention. I just think we need to work on it more.
So should I not worry about this being funded?
I am far from the person who is best at predicting what the legislature is trying to do.
If some
What do you suggest
science.
if a person like me, for example, does not want to see this project get funded, what do you suggest I do?
Well, I think it's always good to communicate with legislators and let them know what your concerns are. You know, early and often, the more face-to-face it is, the more likely it is to be effective. But even emails and phone calls are useful.
Thank you. Back here, yes.
Yeah, this is a question to Aliki. When you say working farms, are you talking about, and it always sounds like small farms, but you're talking about factory farms, the big farms?
No, the phrase working farms and ranches comes from a part of the statute that specifically addresses protecting them for purposes of wildlife corridors and those sort of things. CAPOs, those sorts of large animal feeding operations would not qualify as working farms and ranches as defined under that statute. So these are sort of, basically you're thinking about landowners who maybe have 1,000 acres or 2,000 acres or however many acres they have. A lot of them have had the lands in their families for generations, and they want to be able to keep them as they've been for hundreds of years. They don't want to have to sell them to be a strip mall or, you know what I mean? So it's really a way to help them keep it in conservation. And it really varies from site to site and project to project in terms of what is the working farm, or what's the actual land, what service is it providing? Is it because it's huge swaths of not just wetlands but recharge area, or is it more because it's going to help connect habitat that's critical for the Florida panther? So large animal feeding operations do not.
Let me add a tiny bit more information about that because I think it may just be useful. So agricultural land has development rights on it. It varies from county to county. Here in Alachua County, every acre of ag land has 1 unit per 5 acres that could be built. So if you, as a farmer or a person with an agriculture or a forest person with agricultural zoning, owns 100 acres, you could legally build 20 homes on that 100 acres without additional action on the part of the local government. This is Alachua County, unincorporated Alachua County. City of High Springs may be different, City of Alachua may be different, but unincorporated Alachua County. So what a conservation easement is in general is that you sell the right to develop those homes or whatever the underlying zoning would be. And normally in the process of selling those rights, you also agree to some higher level of stewardship. You're not going to use pesticides. You're not going to you may be able to use pesticides, but you may have some negotiation over what pesticides you use or don't use. Or you may have negotiation over how much water you do or don't pump. You may have negotiation over, how you restore the features of the land or so on. And so that's what a conservation easement is. Now, you still own the land. You own, I actually, when I was with ACT, did a conservation easement right at the end of 39th Avenue where it hits the road that comes up to Alachua, 241. Sorry, I'm from Gainesville. Help me out. 241. 640 acres right there. They had over 100 buildable units. They put a conservation easement on it, and now they have like 5 buildable units or something. And so that's what a conservation easement is. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Great. We're going to take one more question in large group, and then, like I said, they'll stay after. Okay, maybe 2, because I only saw 2 hands up. Bob, and then we'll come into you, Steve.
We live in the Springs region here, and I know we're all really happy that Springs are included in Amendment 1. The reality is the area that's recharging the Springs is over 10 million acres, and we're probably going to have to reduce intensive land uses on 90% of that to actually, if we actually wanted the Springs recover to some semblance of their original beauty and ecological function. So that's way too much land to buy for this program. But you mentioned conservation easements. I assume that they're allowed under this. And it seems like that's the way to go because these spring sheds, essentially everything up here is a spring shed. All this unconfined land that's here on the cars is a spring shed. But the the best way that we've come up with to deal with that is to put conservation easements that require forestry to go on these lands rather than intensive agriculture. Because there's no indication that any kind of intensive agriculture can operate without fertilizer other than along the pine forestry and maybe some pastures. And then almost all these intensive agricultural practices now are using groundwater instead of rainwater to grow the crops. So I just wanted to confirm that conservation easements would be something that could be done. And the other thing is, ultimately, it's going to be who makes these decisions, who does the evaluation, the technical evaluation that you talk about. That's going to make all the difference in the world, because if they have a buddy that wants his lake dredged, or if they have a utility company they work for who wants to put a new pipe in somewhere, and it's not evaluated publicly and transparently, you know it's going to be taken advantage of. $50 million per spring sounds great. Well, the state put in $70 million last year, and it's very hard to see where any of that money is really going to spring restoration. That's just the way it is. So how do we enforce that? How should we be getting the legislature to put some guidance in right into the legislation now? And I think we should. Like we had the Springs Initiative years ago in a task force. Shouldn't we have something like that again and make sure this money's spent wisely?
Yeah, so Dr. Knight, I think that you've raised a number of really worthwhile points. Definitely conservation easements are allowed, and they actually are the thing that is most championed by Adam Putnam, who is certainly a person with a great deal of political respect and clout in Tallahassee. So that's yes to that. I would sort of go back to, we talked about the years between starting with Bob Martinez and Governor Childs and Governor Bush and Governor Chris. We actually had a very, and did I forget Governor Graham? Good Lord. Governor Graham. And by the way, I want to announce, if you have not already gotten an invitation, this Saturday night, Alachua Conservation Trust is honoring Bob Graham for his lifetime of service, including his leadership on this amendment. He was our honorary chair. And when Aliki said we didn't reach out to the Miami Herald, every time I called an editorial board, they had already talked to Bob Graham. So please, he's like a machine, this man, and he's got to be pushing 80. But he is fantastic. Please come out to Prairie Creek Preserve on Saturday to give him recognition due. There are two other honorees, Jerry Baldwin from Marion County, and my good friend Doug Borgbeck. But back to your point, during all of those administrations, they appointed scientists and engineers and capable, caring people to these committees, the ARC committee that chose Florida Forever projects, the Florida Communities Trust. I appeared before the Florida Communities Trust at least a dozen times, and those were capable people in the height of any serious Republican administration you can imagine. We had folks like Bill McCollum. Bill McCollum went to the Orlando Sentinel to argue for this program, and he spoke at our rally 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this is not about partisanship, it's about right and wrong. And I believe that legislators ought to rely on the good people of the state of Florida to appoint scientists and engineers and people who can make objective decisions rather than, as you say, here's my buddy, or here's the person with the greatest political power, or the most effective lobbyist in Tallahassee. These should not be earmarked funds. They should be designated to programs based on, the policy direction that they're given through the Constitution, and they should allow a sensible, defensible, transparent process. Now, is that going to happen? I don't honestly know, but it's certainly not going to happen if people like us don't make sure that we communicate to our legislators and we ask others to.
Just after that, though, real quick, part of why we keep emphasizing that Amendment 1 money should first go to existing programs like Florida Forever is because the processes that you're talking about exist.
Exist in statute.
Exist already, and they work very well. The other thing, just to point out, for your interest, and I am not an expert on it, but I'm sure I'm happy to help you get more information about it. There is the Senate Bill 918, which has the Springs program, and by no means do I think that Springs, as it would be composed of the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of DEP, 2 water scientists, and some representatives of water management districts. So there is in that bill a process for making sure that there's a more apolitical way of going about assigning projects. The other thing about, just quickly, conservation easements, that's actually got, I mean, when you talk to, when you want to figure out what's popular with legislators, conservation easements are pretty popular when it comes to protecting lands. So I think there is some hope there, and you gave me hope that if that's actually an effective tool for protecting springs, then that's something that we can all, there's agreement, that's more common ground.
Yeah, well, they have to be managed and reviewed so that people don't start planting row crops.
Yeah, they really, I mean,
and there are examples of that that are lands on other water management districts that had conservation easements to be kept, those uses kept off, and then nobody checked.
yeah, a good conservation easement is inspected annually. There's a checklist and there's a process for enforcement, and normally the strongest easements are actually held not just by one, whether it's the water management district or the local government or a nonprofit, but 2, so that there's a check and balance. And I'll say, having worked on many easements, the challenge isn't typically with the landowner who enters into the easement, it's with the successive landowner, whether it's their child or grandchild or whether they sell the property. And I have an entertaining story that came out of Yankeetown that I'll share with you over a beer some night, Bob. But they are not without their challenges, I think, as you pointed out.
Ladies and gentlemen, in order to honor our time that we committed to for the Women's Club, I'm going to cut the questions there, but you will have a little bit of time. We have some refreshments out for everybody. But you know what? The whole concept of Water Voices is to educate those of us that are willing to learn, and we're the heart and the soul of people that take it out there. And I see elected officials and artists and photographers and a lot of people from different environmental organizations. So I urge you strongly to listen, learn, and thank God Doug taped it, because I'm going to have to study this thing afterwards. All the